So welcome all to the Migration Conundrum, Challenges for a Common European Response. My name is Matteo Ville, I'm a research fellow here at ISPI Milan. And so welcome. Let me remind you that you as the audience can participate to this event by sending questions our way through Facebook and all our other channels. We will select some of your questions and pitch them to our panelists today. So as an introduction, as you might remember, last year, almost exactly 12 months ago, the European Commission came forward with a new Pact on Migration and Asylum, a package of proposals to reform the way in which the EU manages migration flows. Since then, very little progress has been made. This was to be expected, given that many countries, among others Hungary and Poland, but many more moderate governments as well, oppose moving more competencies on managed migration up to the EU level. And even when some agreement seems to be within reach, the devil is constantly in the details. We've seen this in action in Afghanistan just a few weeks ago, even after an outstanding evacuation effort that brought to Europe around 25,000 Afghans in just 2 weeks. The way the EU is responding right now, so please do not come, stay there, shows a constant focus on policies to stem migration flows rather than trying to protect those fleeing and offer legal pathways to those willing to come. So where do we go from here? Joining me today in this discussion on the new Pact, European policies and beyond are 4 high-level experts. So let me introduce them to you. Mathieu Tardis is Research Fellow at the Center for Migration and Citizenship at the Institut Français de Relations Internationales in Paris. Julien Simon is Head of Mediterranean Region at the International Center for Migration Policy Development in Vienna. Chiara Cardoletti is representative to Italy, the Holy See and San Marino for the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And Lawrence Hart is the Director of the Coordination Office for the Mediterranean at the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. So let me start from Mathieu Tardis. Mathieu, on the new pact, do you see progress moving forward? And do you think that member states are willing and able to design and implement a common response to migration challenges? Okay. So we might have lost connection with our guests. We're waiting for Mathieu to come back, but I guess that can I introduce him, or maybe I can tell you something about what to expect on migration policy in Europe. You've seen last year in 2020 in September, we were eagerly waiting for this proposal from the Commission, and it took us a lot of months. Clearly, there was the pandemic going on,
Recording in progress.
And the Commission managed to propose this pact after many months in waiting. But even after that, clearly member states have remained at loggerheads between each other. They've been fighting constantly. We know that some of them, I mentioned them earlier, Hungary and Poland, constantly not just see migration as a national competence, but they do not even want to talk about whether we can put migration together. And I'm waiting for something about whether I can introduce the panelists. Can you tell me something, Bea? Can I? Okay, so Mathieu, sorry for this. So the question was, how do you evaluate cooperation on migration between Europe and other countries? And what can we learn from that? How can this help us to assess? Sorry, this was the question for Julien. So Mathieu, on the new pact, do you see progress moving forward? Do you think member states are willing and able to design and implement a common response to migration challenges? Mathieu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you to ISPI to invite me. I'm very glad to be here with you with the 3 other panelists. My answer would be first that I don't see so much progress about on the EU Pact, and I will elaborate why. Of course, the Pact, as you mentioned, was presented a year ago exactly by the European Commission. It was presented as a fresh start for EU migration and asylum policy, which I don't think that's so much the case. And lately, and during the events of this summer, it was as well presented by some EU institutions, the European Commission and some EU parliamentarians and EU Council. as a way to address as well the situation we had to face this summer. I'm thinking about the situation at the border between Belarus and Lithuania, and we will discuss it, I guess, a little bit later, and Chiara will elaborate a bit more about that, about the situation right now of the Afghans. I think it's a bit presumptuous to do so, because the situation of the Belarus-Lithuania has little to do with migration issues somehow, although it impacts thousands of migrants and refugees. And so that's something else that is at stake. And then again, we'll discuss again later about the situation in Afghanistan. First of all, the Pact is very unbalanced on many aspects. And for me, raised some issues regarding the decision-making process within the EU right now. Why is very unbalanced? First, it's very normative on some aspects, mostly on security aspects regarding to migration management. And let's face it, I mean, the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum is first and foremost an EU Pact on management of irregular arrivals in the EU. It's mostly that. And on the international protection aspect and even human rights aspect, it's way less normative and way more weak than on the protect and security aspect. And I'm thinking here about the rescue at sea recommendation, the disembarkation rules, or the legal pathway for refugees, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little later about that. Here it's just guidelines, recommendation to member states, not a normative legislation that could impose some common rules to member states. When it comes to the border procedure, I mean, the European Commission just suggests to create some very complex system of screening between people at the external EU border. We can go into details a bit later if you want, which is when you manage to get through all the pact, which is several hundred pages, it's quite consistent in the paper. I'm not talking about conformity with human rights and refugee law, but in the paper it can be consistent if you have a very complex figures and on how it could work. But I don't think it would be very manageable in the ground, in the real life, in the real world as it is today. Why so, in my view? First, I'm actually wondering whether it's relevant to still wish for a same or uniform system at every point of the external EU borders or within the EU. The situation between the different borders and the territories of the EU are very different. I mean, talking first about the profiles of the migrants and the refugees who arrive, third, they change over time and they change over space. So the profiles of the people who are coming through Spain, Italy, or Greece are not at all the same. So sometimes it can be seem to be unfair or inefficient to apply the same kind of rules to these people. I would say as well, and Julien will elaborate on that what is key as well, the relationship with third country, and the EU rely more and more on third country to manage migration flow. And then again, the relationship between Spain and Morocco is not at all the same as the relationship between Greece and Turkey, for instance. So we can have the same kind of partnership between these two countries. For Italy, it's different to discuss with Tunisian authorities than to discuss with, I don't know which authorities in Libya. So then again, why should we apply the same system in every part of the EU? The pact is not going to be implemented in a vacuum. I mean, each country has their own legal constitutional framework. The role of the judges will be very important to the extent to which we can keep migrants and refugees with a restriction of movement. The legal and constitutional framework in each country will not be the same in that regard, and at the end, the national judges will be the judge of a situation. And finally, this complex machinery is not workable in the field, won't be workable in the field. I mean, we have an example with what happened in 2015 and the so-called hotspot approach. And if I take just the example of Greece, I think it's more than 3 billion euro that was poured to Greece from the EU to manage the so-called migration crisis or refugee crisis. For what result? I mean, we still have a camp in the island, we still have Moria. So we then can state that it's very consistent, that we want to implement the same EU standard, but at the end, it's going to be to the member state to apply that, because there is no transfer of competence to the EU. So each member state we're going to apply to implement this new regulation if they are adopted. To conclude, certainly, in my opinion, the EU Pact is not a fresh start, including when it comes to the content, and is very continuum to the last 20 years and what has been proposed and implemented in the EU. It might be the last chance for EU to have a European policy on migration and asylum, and raise really the issue of the EU governance. The pact is a result of a consensus. I mean, this is how the EU is usually working, but is it still working like that, or is it possible to still work like that? At the end, the European Commission has made some compromise with some countries, and I'm talking here mostly about the Visegrad countries like Hungary, but those countries do not want compromise. And right away after the presentation of the pact, Viktor Orban said, no, we don't want that text. So how we function, how the EU work with governments that proclaim themselves to be irregular and don't want to play by the rules. And we have to bear in mind that since the last 5 years, for the last 5 years, since 2015, the EU framework has been constantly neglected by almost all member states, and was proved to be useless somehow.
Mathieu, can I ask you to conclude? I want to pose a question to you.
For instance, the situation at sea, the rescue at sea routes and the disembarkation was after Matteo Salvini just forbade the Aquarius to land in Italy. The response has been just by a handful of member states, or the same, mostly in the western part of the continent. And those member states, who are the strongest member states, have not been able to impose this regulation, these rules to other member states. So at the end, we've been seeing that the functionalist theory that was at the very core of the EU Pact 70 years ago did not prove right here. According to this theory, a crisis leads to more transfer to the EU level, to European level. Here we see the opposite. Like we see that the more the crisis is deepening in Europe when it comes to migration management, the less the EU level is being resorted to. And I'm finishing here.
Thank you. Thank you. This is important. You sound a note of caution, Mathieu, but I want to a bit challenge your point of view, because I think you are totally right on many aspects of migration policies, and yet on some aspects of migration policies there seems to be, some way of moving forward, and that's externalization, right? Controlling the borders. So the more we talk about controlling the borders, the more we find common ground in Europe, and the more we can do things together. Actually, the Frontex budget, so the European Border and Coast Guard Agency's budget, has quintupled is foreseen to quintuple over the next 7 years. So there is room to cooperate sometimes, but only, as you say, if interests align. So do you think, if you can, in a minute, do you think there is some room, some leeway to find some coordinated or aligning interests in the future, or do you expect this to continue and then no coordination, just piecemeal approaches?
I mean, you're right. The only common interest of all member states is to develop partnership, as we say, with third country in the management of migration flows to Europe. So we read several EU Council declaration or European Council declaration to state that the priority of the EU should be to first to prevent irregular arrivals and to increase return to third country. But there are just statements at the end. I mean, that's true, there's a shift, and there's a shift of responsibility, and I think there's a shift as well of sovereignty somehow to this country, and we've seen in the last couple of months what risk it could encounter for the EU on other aspects. I mean, we had the case of the relationship with Morocco in May, with Belarus this summer as well, with Turkey, which is a case study per se somehow, which is kind of blackmailing, and some are already talking about weaponing. The weaponization of migrants when it comes towards the EU. But beside or behind this joint declaration, who is doing what? And at the end, there's still a couple of member states who is very serious about partnership with the country.
Thank you.
Who is contributing to the trust fund? I mean, not Hungary at the same, still not Hungary.
Okay, so thank you. Sorry to cut you short, but then I see you've answered my question in a sense to say somewhat no, right? We can externalize policies, but possibly not really cooperate on finding solidarity solutions within your member states, or maybe not. Maybe I'll come back to you anyway after our first round. So Julien, I want to move on to you because actually this question follows neatly in what I want to ask you. So do you see anyway, how do you evaluate the way cooperation on migration between Europe and other countries has gone on? So for instance, with African countries, and namely those on the southern shore of the Mediterranean, and what can we learn from that?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel and address these very challenging questions. And the conundrum that you call, I think it's extremely well put, the difficulties we are all facing. Well, the way I see things is that when it comes to cooperation with third countries in southern partners, myself focusing particularly on the southern neighborhood of the European Union, is that there is de facto a political gap. What we see as the political gap is the fact that while in Europe, migration is very high on the political agenda and does impact all the aspects of the way we are going to tackle this issue in Europe and address it as a group of countries, but also in partnership with others. The problem is that the external dimension of migration, the way we see it, is more tackled from a technical angle, from tackling the issue of migration as a technical matter which can be dealt with the partners, putting aside the political concerns. I believe that this, in order to shape a way forward on creating a new era, if you will, of cooperation on migration with our southern partners, we need to fully incorporate this gap and try not to just avoid it, this reality. It doesn't mean that it's one cannot find solution around it, but it needs to be fully taken into account. Over the last 20 years, we see that partnerships in the Mediterranean particularly have evolved dramatically. As much as Europe has put migration top on its migration agenda gradually over the last 2 decades, our partners have quite well responded to that issue and worked in cooperation. Working with countries such as Morocco 20 years ago has nothing to do with working with a country like Morocco nowadays. The development, for instance, of capacities has marked tremendously the level of engagement and also the level of responsiveness when it comes to a balanced dialogue and a balanced partnership on migration. While 20 years ago, we used to use capacity building as the term that was standardized to talk about cooperation, we have fortunately evolved towards capacity development, and we dare think that we are now on the verge or on the it's about time to move into capacity partnerships. We have now an opportunity when when you take into account basically the way how things have evolved, the new agenda for the Mediterranean, for instance, offers a framework within which we can operate to position migration, first and foremost, in a wider spectrum of cooperation in the Euro-Mediterranean area, but also to basically engage and call for, or to go beyond words, I would say, when it comes to the way we cooperate with one another. The agenda itself calls for renewed partnership, or now whether you call it renewed, revitalized, reimagined, redefined, and so on and so forth. I think it's important to go beyond semantic and to really put action into the concept. That is the reason why, in order to determine the common ground, we have particularly looked into the way we are going to promote an approach which is going to put at the heart of it joint leadership, shared responsibility. If we want to put this relationship and make it workable, we need A, to acknowledge the political gap, and B, to focus on something which would represent the common ground. Capacities can be one of these. So we will work particularly on this angle, I believe, in general, in the coming years. And we see this resonating with a number of countries quite strongly. These capacity partnership, if you will, would be very much driven by what we like to call in ICMPD the migration partnership drivers. Migration partnership drivers would be going beyond the traditional thematic categorization or of migration themes, and try to identify these cross-cutting efforts which would need to be focused on in order to bring us to this new era of cooperation. We have identified a number of those, including governing migration partnership, professionalizing migration partnerships, and modernizing migration partnerships, and finally, communicating on migration partnerships. Very recently, I think it was on Saturday, Commissioner Skinas intervened in relation to the situation at the border between Belarus and Lithuania, if I'm not mistaken, underlining the importance of that now is the moment to engage not in an operation of firefighting, but in an operation of architecture. And while it might sound like an easy statement, the fact is that I believe that there are indeed, there is a growing interest and growing appetite in a number of countries to try to reduce the silence of migration in the migration debate or in the cooperation debate in general, because this silence of migration, when part of a distorted and uncontrolled narrative, unfortunately dramatically limits policy options for most of our partners. And limiting policy options is something that the government does not wish to have, because it would have a tendency to corner the concerned country and limits its flexibility. Finally, in this regard, yeah, sorry, tell me.
No, I just wanted to come back to you, but if you're going to conclude, please do.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to conclude with regard to this alignment of interest and priorities that were highlighted by Mathieu. Indeed, I think the concept of Team Europe might be one of this pragmatic approach which might allow us to align and make a number of countries work together and develop a culture of cooperation with a number of countries, southern partner countries. For instance, we have a tendency to picture our partners in Eastern Europe as being reluctant to cooperate within Europe, but also externally. Fact is that in a number of instances, they would have a strong interest to partner together and work closer with some of our southern partners, for instance, and develop a culture of cooperation and partnership. That might be a way to find this common ground and develop this common, at least capacity-focused agendas. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Julien, because you give us actually almost an inside view, and that's why I want to come back to you. You were straight on the fact that there is a need for more partnership and to actually reevaluate them in light in which migration, maybe the silence of it gets reduced, and then you underline the fact that some countries, even in Eastern Europe, could be more prone to migration cooperation, even on migration policies, if we reframe that. But what I want to ask you, even as the head of parts of ICMPD, you often cooperate with third countries. You talk to them all the time. So what is the appetite from these third countries, especially those that most are relevant for us? And what is your thermometer? What is your gauge of the willingness of cooperation on this policy compared to others? And do you see this evolving over time? If you can answer this in a minute.
Well, I think the willingness will be there when it comes to being pragmatic about the fact that Europe puts it as high as possible almost on its political agenda, and not willing to cooperate with Europe on the matter, here to limit areas of cooperation. So I think that there is a degree of willingness. Of course, you will have partners always who would have a higher or lower degree of cooperation, for instance. And I think it's not a secret. Algeria might not be a country which has the highest or the largest history of cooperation on this theme. It's a choice. It's a sovereign choice not to particularly engage into cooperation. Others will have identified this as a key matter of relationship with Europe, Morocco being the most obvious, for instance, examples. But I think that there will be a willingness. Now, what we need to make sure of is that it is tackled from a pragmatic perspective. It is tackled in a appeased debate, basically, because as long as this very high political pressure of a crisis mode or crisis management mode, both in terms of communication and reality in Europe, will be influencing the way we cooperate with partners, that will create tension, that will create imbalance in the relationship.
Thank you so much, Julien. You made, and I stress this, a very important point, dialoguing with partners, not putting too much pressure on them, so that we can really achieve something and find common ground and common solutions without the heat of politics always in the foreground. So thanks a lot. Let me move to Chiara Cardoletti. She's representative to Italy, the Holy See and San Marino for the UN Refugees Agency. And I wanted to ask something that is relevant to Europe, but mostly that's been happening in current events. So that's Afghanistan. So turning to Afghanistan, what is happening? If you can tell us what's happening and what you see on the ground, and what can the Afghan crisis teach us on how Europe tends to react to international crisis and possibly to sudden movements of people in need of protection. Sorry, we're going to mute you, Chiara. Oh, you should unmute yourself. Try. Thank you.
Is that all right? Great. Thank you so much for having me here. We take any opportunity to talk about refugees. So glad to be on this panel. So what is happening in Afghanistan? I'm sure that my colleague Lawrence will talk more about that. But in a nutshell, since the beginning of the year, we have been seeing an escalation, of course, of the fighting in the country, with sort of the outcome that we have all seen in recent weeks on TV, which have produced until now up to 570,000 displaced people, which, of course, in a context of a country where the economy is largely collapsing, and where, of course, we are now about to see sort of the arrival of the winter, we are very concerned about the humanitarian situation in the country. We are also equally concerned about the human rights situation in the country and the potential it has for a large number of people leaving the country in search for safety. So this is obviously there's been a lot of panic about what is happening in Afghanistan, how are people going to be treated, how is the country going to survive, how many people will leave the country, where are they going to be going, are they all coming to Europe? And that's been a major concern, obviously, of the international community. And a big emphasis has been placed on, obviously, understanding a little bit what are the dynamics there. What we can say for sure is that for the time being, we haven't seen any massive movements, that in any case, should there be massive movements in the next few weeks to a month, we do have traditional historical asylum countries that have been hosting the majority of the Afghans. Pakistan and Iran come to mind, and that obviously that will be the first port of call, despite of the rhetoric at the moment, and it is very possible that some obviously will also come to Europe. So obviously for us has been a priority to advocate for people being able to leave the country should they so wish, and that people should be able to access the neighboring countries, and that obviously financial support should be made available to these countries so that they can continue doing what they have been doing for now 40 years. We are obviously telling Europe that they should also be aware that some people will come, not in the large number that everybody is scared about, but in numbers that are going to be much more contained, but that nonetheless an answer will have to be given, and obviously asylum needs to be secure for these people. So in a sense, I do not want to dwell too much on Afghanistan itself, because I know Lawrence will talk about it, but what does it mean for the Afghans, and what does it mean for Europe? It means that what we have heard, and Mathieu was just talking about, that a rhetoric of fear, a rhetoric of that has ranged from we are going to be invaded to we're going to have a bunch of terrorists on our territory. And what we are seeing in terms of what we're learning is that even in the context of a very clear refugee emergency, Europe is struggling to come up with a united approach. And that's very concerning, obviously, because it is exactly and precisely in moments like this that we need a united approach, and a united approach that that comes up with a framework of response. And for UNHCR, we have welcomed over the past year and a half the arrival of a new pact. We do believe it's extremely important that there is a basis on which to operate, despite of the fact that obviously it has a lot of aspects that need to be further strengthened. We do believe that it's better to have something than nothing, and that obviously we are better placed to work on a system if we have a starting point. We also believe that it's extremely important that governments do have the prerogative of controlling their borders, but that this is done in a way that enables people to access territory and asylum. And here is where I think the concerns lies. How do we secure that Afghans and others continue to have access to the European territory? Is if arrivals are managed in a way that do not create panic, that do not create security concerns, that do not create a sense of loss of control. And so the pact here comes in very handy. We've made a number of recommendations to European countries in relation to this pact. And obviously we were thinking when we were making these recommendations about an emergency. Here we have a potential one. And what we obviously have asked that solidarity mechanisms within the context of Europe be predictable, be effective and predictable, and that everything should not be left in the hands of sort of volunteer contribution by member states, but rather there should be a basis on which to operate that is a little bit more predictable. And clearly redistribution is one such issue. We have asked countries to be responsive in terms of swift response to emergencies, and obviously to have a common approach to partners. I mean, to countries that are at the external border of Europe that respects the fact that many of them have been, traditional partners in terms of being asylum country for so many years, and the positive approach to what they have done, it's absolutely fundamental. And of course, what we are worried about is that a lack of a united and predictable approach will then result into a sort of each country taking measures, the future in their own hands, and taking unilateral approaches, including when it comes to the extraterritorial dimension of such approaches. So we have, in that context, also been making important recommendations in regards to border procedures and how they should be handled, etc. What we are seeing, however, is yet again a lack of a sort of united political vision and a united also ability to take responses. And that's obviously very concerning. If that's okay, Matteo, I'll leave it at that. I know that you have more questions for me.
Yes, Chiara. Actually, let me do something unusual. So let me go to Lawrence first, and then come back to you for a general question, more general question. It will be more as a debate this way. So I just wanted to ask Lawrence Hart, Director for Coordination Office for the Mediterranean, the International Organization for Migration, but especially you have been the International Organization for Migration's Chief of Mission and Special Envoy in Afghanistan between 2016 and 2019. So you have hands-on, on-the-ground knowledge of recent developments there. So my question to you is, what do you expect on Afghanistan, its population, its needs, its possible movements, and how could this reflect on Europe?
Thank you, Matteo. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to ISPI for organizing this event to which I'm invited. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. Yes, indeed. Well, Afghanistan is a country that has been almost fallen in the back burner in the last years and just reappeared suddenly this summer. There was a sense of fatigue, both from donors and from others, in trying to solve a situation which had been overwhelmingly gone into a containment mode in the last years. Now, what's happening now? There's a looming crisis, and Chiara has given that headline just before me. The cost of essential goods like oil and flour is going up considerably. The bank sector is in crisis. There is a lack of liquidity, making the situation even more difficult in the long term, not just in the short term. Indeed, humanitarian aid, as was mentioned, given that Afghanistan has been experiencing over the year a number of displacements, as well as emigration, is indeed key importance, but is only a stopgap measure. It's the classical, medicine aspirin that you give to someone who has a severe illness. So there is a need to look at the whole issue a little bit more long term and in a strategic manner. Just to give you some just a figure is that, for example, before the collapse of the government, 43% of the GDP of Afghanistan, so basically coming from foreign aid, was injected into humanitarian development and security spending. Now, how that is going to, now that is gone or will be reprogrammed, that is going to have obviously serious consequences on the situation of the country. Moreover, a serious drought in this year in 2021 has compounded the malnutrition of a lot of people, including children, which affects 1 Afghan out of 3 in Afghanistan. Also, to say that the salaries of public employees were largely paid and financed by foreign donors or the World Bank, and we're talking of more than 400 people alone in Kabul. Finally, I think it's also important to underscore that a lot of the people leaving nowadays are qualified, well talented, have enjoyed a lot of important education, which constitutes a brain drain, basically. Now, the resilience of the country, how that country is going to manage this dramatic and choppy waters coming ahead, that is going to be a real problem. How do we make sure that this brain drain is not a permanent brain drain, but is something that can be refunneled, rechanneled into a long-term vision and a long-term strategy? Then there is geopolitical interest when it comes to Afghanistan. There's no secret, and that a variety of political analysts have already given a lot of analysis on the role of the vacuum that the NATO alliance, the NATO countries, the European Union will be leaving to other actors and how they will manage that. So I think we're in a very interesting position, a dramatic and difficult position. But it's what was said before I took the floor. There is a need. It's an opportunity now to take a common and comprehensive plan for addressing migration and refugees as one of the aspects. Obviously, we have to look at the crisis in Afghanistan from that angle, but not necessarily only from that angle, from the migration and refugee angle. But the history has taught us, and I think we don't have to go very far away in history, that there has been comprehensive plans of action. Is that something that can be readjusted into the Afghanistan context? Well, that requires a lot of creativity and also unity in trying to address the issue of Afghanistan. The involvement of neighboring countries needs to be dissected. It's not just about writing a check to the neighboring country and saying manage the flow of migrants and refugees, but it's about how you manage it and how we actually share the burden all together when it comes to large flows or actually pouring in.
Lawrence, we lost.
Sorry, we
lost the first part? The last part?
Yes, here I am. Yeah. So there is a need also to see how neighboring countries will be involved, and that is also strategic into thinking how that is done. Obviously, it doesn't help if each and individual Secretary of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs travels to the region and tries to get the best deal out of it. It's a question of having a unified and united approach. Now, here's the point that I think I would like to conclude on my first round, is that here we're talking, when it comes to migration and refugees, there's always this polarization between interest and principles. Oftentimes the challenge is to see where these two elements, interest and principle, actually intersects, because when a country betrays, or when a group of countries betrays its values, it also betrays its interests. Let's look at the hard facts of what migration is actually contributing to economy. Let's look at how much the GDP of countries are enriched by the migrants and refugees, and probably we will have a different narrative than the toxic one that is oftentimes affecting us when it comes to talking about migrants and refugees. And I think an example of that, and I will conclude on this, is to see how different the narrative is when we talk about migration from a capital perspective and when we talk about migration from a local authority or city perspective. The latter tends to see very much migrants and refugees as an asset rather than a beneficiary, because they are conscious and cognizant that those group of people actually contribute to the economy, to the backbone of the economy of the cities. Obviously, this doesn't pertain to all cities, but the major cities which we're talking with, we are receiving that narrative. And I think it's important to talk about interests and principles in a very strategic manner.
Thank you, Lawrence. Absolutely important to focus on interests and principles. So let me get back to Chiara Cardoletti and ask her, exactly on this matter, what is the position of UNHCR on the new pact on migration? So let's go back to Europe. So do you think that protection is sufficiently in focus there? And do you see critical points moving forward?
Well, thanks a lot, Matteo. I think there's a lot of critical points, as I was saying earlier. And unless we can overcome those critical points, we are not going to see a pact that is effective. I think Matteo has highlighted a few of the fundamental issues, but certainly the issue of how the union goes about ensuring that there is an equal distribution of the responsibility in relation to those who are arriving, whether this be arriving by sea or by land. I think that's a fundamental issue. Otherwise, we will always have frontline states facing the larger burden, facing situations that at times they are not able to cope with. So if the union is to be effective in relation to managing properly asylum and migration, they need to be able to agree on how arrivals are going to be distributed amongst the union. And I still see that we are heavily reliant on voluntary contribution, even in the context of resettlement, which is very worrisome, particularly given that Europe is still receiving a very, very limited number of of resettlement throughout the year. So even then, we're seeing that even when it is about sort of making voluntary contribution to resettlement, we're not seeing really the common front that we should see. Same goes with the approach towards border procedures. As I said earlier, we are not against borders being in place. In fact, we believe that it's extremely important that whatever procedures that are related to screening and asylum need to be as effective as possible, precisely to ensure the integrity of those procedures. But this being said, they have to be fair and they have to be accessible. And we are seeing different approaches in different countries. And clearly, once again, frontline countries are having difficulties in understanding exactly how the rest of the Union would like these procedures to be implemented. So we've been doing a lot of work to try and explain how these procedures could be implemented in a way that it's expedited but also fair. Monitoring is another huge issue. How are we going to monitor all of this? How are we going to make sure that the countries are doing the right things? And how are we going to make sure that they are abiding by their commitment? And I believe that there are many other aspects from how we're going to pursue family reunification in a way that it's as unbureaucratic as possible, that it makes sure that family can be unified in a timely manner. But I do believe that still, perhaps the easiest aspect of this pact, which is the external dimension, where many countries in the EU have a lot of experience on in terms of how to manage our partners. Even there, we have not yet been able to secure a common approach. And that is fundamental if we are to ensure that people who are fleeing conflicts are able to stay as closely as possible to home. So there has to be a different way of managing partners. There is a lot more positive, there is a lot more engaging, there is a lot more geared towards not only the humanitarian needs, but also the development needs. So there's a lot of work to be done still. And I do hope that this emergency or this potential emergency, and there's a few others that I see coming on our way. If this emergency is not able to put the European heads together in terms of coming up with a framework for response, then I do fear that we may go many more years without a proper framework on asylum and migration.
Thank you a lot, Chiara. I think this frames the picture very neatly. Let's not forget that sometimes we often look at faraway crises as impacting directly on European borders. And at the same time, as you say, sometimes some crises can be a bit more unexpected. Maybe, some Afghans might want to try to get to Europe, and we will see an increase in flows in the near future, but possibly not from people coming directly from Afghanistan, but from the 500,000 people that are waiting, Afghans in Turkey, waiting for an opportunity to come to Europe. So sometimes, the same people, same nationalities might come from different ways. We really need to keep an open mind in the future and maybe find some rational ways to cooperate. So that's an important call from your side. So given that we have the last 10 minutes, I'd say, let me move to questions. And let me actually take a minute to answer a question that hit my mind, and I have some data to back it up, because it really shows how different perceptions and sometimes different expectations really frame the way in which we look at migration together. So this question says, from Marco Ferrario, says, a demographer has estimated that 500 million African persons will try to enter Europe over the next 30 years. Keep in mind, 500 million people, African persons, is almost half of the African population right now. How is Europe preparing to handle this event? Well, let me just say, last year, we at ISPI, and me personally, we authored a book that is called The Future of Migration to Europe. And we tried to estimate how many Africans will try to reach the continent over the next 30 years. And it's not 500 million. So our expectations is it's going to be about 10 million. Which is still considerable, but if you think about the fact that in Europe we are around 500 million, it's not exactly such an so-called invasion. So when we frame figures and pictures and expectations and forecasts into the right context, sometimes we can, try to find common ground when other expectations actually would move us away and put us into fear mode. So just, I just wanted to set the record straight on what we can expect to happen in the future as Europeans. That said, clearly unexpected things can always happen, but please try to focus on what has happened in the past to understand our future. But moving to our guests, I would like to go to Mathieu for this question, because it's actually on something that he has worked on. Carlo D'Amore from University of Messina asks about sponsorization. And he asks about opportunities and criticalities in there. So whenever we sponsor for some person to come to Europe, how can we solve the problem for the fact that sponsorships are very limited, and especially usually there is money for the resettlement of these persons, but not necessarily for integrating them, and so this becomes a cost to the collectivity. So your evaluation on this, do you think that European policies might focus more on sponsorships, or do you think this is set to remain just a limited policy and we should focus on something else?
Thank you. I think private sponsorship, we're talking about private sponsorship, I mean groups of citizens that can sponsor refugees to Europe is a very interesting solution, is one solution among others. It will never be a large numbers, in my opinion, even compared to resettlements, because you have to find the citizens that will be willing to take responsibility, and including financial responsibility, to welcome and host these refugees. Still, I believe there are a lot of very positive side effects somehow. First of all, when it comes to integration, experiences, initiatives, mostly from Canada, because they are the most advanced when it comes to private sponsorship, but including the first assessment we're having about the emerging sponsorship systems in Europe. And Italy is the champion of sponsorship in Europe right now. We've seen that there's very good indicators when it comes to integration, and it's really a driver for integration for the refugees. And I think some indicator that it proves that it's quite positive is you see less secondary movement, which within refugees who have been sponsored compared to refugees who have been resettled, or even so-called spontaneous refugees, for instance, from Southern European countries to Northern European countries. So I think it has a lot. And another positive side effect, it's a way as well to protect and to enhance a welcoming society. And let's be sure that Europeans are still open to international protection and to refugees, and to involve the society into the international refugee protection system somehow is a way as well to have more stakeholders in the game. And it's not only states that can, from one day to another, say, okay, let's stop with resettlement. And this is what happened in Denmark, for instance, and more or less happen in the US. And I think it's interesting that you have citizens involved, because they still be very open and protective to refugee issues, and say so to the government as well.
Thank you, Mathieu. So important, clearly remaining limited, but important to talk about that. Let me turn to Julien, because I have a question for him. Specifically two, I will merge them, and if I can, I ask you to answer within 2 minutes so that I can move to the other speakers as well. That's about, first, how do you see when countries approach one another, and third countries, EU countries approach third countries, do you think that some governments have different interests than the EU as a whole, and they act differently? This is a question from Rima, who asks also whether this is affecting the way in which we handle irregular migration over the central Mediterranean. So do you see some governments acting differently from others, and do you think that this failure of harmonizing our policy response has some impact on that? And the second question is, how do you evaluate, from Nino Marzullo, what is the role of Turkey in the next, in migration crisis in general, from the question, but what do you think that is our relationship with Turkey, and can you elaborate on that, whether from your point of view this has been a productive relationship or whether there are some criticalities on that? Please, if you can, in 2 minutes. I know it's a lot to ask.
Well, thank you. Then I might skip the question on Turkey, because it's not the region I cover, so I would not be the one mandated to talk about that. But when it comes to the different approaches and in developing cooperation with southern partners, I think it's evident indeed that not everything is aligned. We see that, for instance, when it comes to the way we have assessed the use of financial instruments and cooperation instruments in determining the priorities upon which countries should work on as a group in the framework, for instance, of the Valletta Summit and the Joint Valletta Action Plan. It is quite interesting, the efforts which have been put into place in order to give a coherence to the overall approach and cooperation. Nevertheless, when one collects information in the various areas that are worked on, one would notice that indeed the national interest would have a strong influence, also because it creates ground for cooperation in other sectors, migration being such an important item on the agenda. So I think that, yes, in reality, there are a number of approaches which are perhaps not that coordinated. And very recently, a high-level official from Germany passed a comment saying that it is absolutely important that we start making sense of all we do as a group. And I think that, again, Team Europe approach might be a very interesting approach, not trying to forcefully have all EU member states on board, but at least the ones who are managing to align their interests and priorities in order to create a positive framework for cooperation with our partners.
Thank you, Simon. So moving to another question, Chiara. Sophie Duval, from an advocacy officer at the French NGO CCFD Terre Solidaire, asks, do you think that the resettlement forum announced by the European Commission regarding Afghanistan could be an opportunity to change this voluntary approach on resettlement in the EU? Do you want to comment on that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, let's start by saying that resettlement is obviously a very important, but nonetheless limited solutions for refugees. It does not replace, obviously, access to territory, to asylum. We like to remember that, because these days there's a lot of emphasis on resettlement, humanitarian corridors, and other legal pathways, which are really important. But none of these should ever be as a substitute to the possibility of people seeking asylum. So that's, I guess, number one. Number two, obviously, we believe that any initiatives that brings together EU member states on resettlement is an important initiative. We would like, obviously, to have a more sort of commitment that brings together countries on a more predictable basis. But obviously, it's a very good step in the right direction. The more the merrier. The more places made available to Afghans, the better for us, because it does provide a solution to extremely vulnerable and people who are at extreme risk in their country of asylum. So obviously, we welcome that. But clearly, if this should really be moving forward towards a much more predictable and sort of responsibility sharing arrangement that enable all countries of the European Union to pitch in and step in.
Thank you, Chiara. So let me just move to the final closing question for Lawrence. I know it's a tricky one, but let's see if you want to answer this. Muhammad Yagi, a researcher from Amman in Jordan, asks, did Europe policy in the so-called Greater Middle East contribute to these waves of refugees to Europe? So is there some fault from the European policies as well? And about Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan in particular, and do you think that this increases the pressure on Europeans to show some solidarity right now?
I'm sorry. I think I was disconnected for. I missed the beginning of your question. I'm really sorry, but I was disconnected.
So,
can you just repeat it?
Muhammad asked, did European policies in the so-called Greater Middle East contribute to waves of refugees and possibly even irregular migrants to Europe? And he says, I'm thinking of Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan as well. So, do you have a response to that? Do you think that Europeans should feel obligated by some policy failures, or is there something else?
Well, let's say that there is no one size fits all. I mean, there are different contexts, different countries. The one you mentioned, and I think they're very valid examples, but very different in in the kind of responses. I think the issue of Libya is one that there is a need to have a frank discussion about burden sharing and how that might pan out. What are the responsibilities? What are the benefits of migration to Libya? We're recently discussing with other UN agencies in Libya the opportunities for circular migration and labor migration to fill the economic gaps. So in that respect, I think it's more of a question of how Libya can harness the benefits and the potential of migrants while at the same time preserving their rights when they arrive on that territory. Different, I think, is the approach with Syria and Afghanistan. I think the issue, and I go back to the point that we have to look at interests and principles at the same time and where they intersect. I think Afghanistan is absolutely important because it represents, first of all, has been important for the EU. There's been considerable money invested in reinforcing structures, in capacitating people, and that treasure should not go lost. When it comes, obviously, to Syria, then we have a different situation where that was obviously geopolitical interests that, like in other countries, that obviously interfered with the concept of capacity development and nation building. So there is no one size fits all. There is a complexity there, and it's a complexity well reflected also in the Pact that other speakers have alluded to. I think there is no shortcut in that. I think we need to unpack a phenomenon which is very complex and go beyond the headlines. But it does require an approach where group of states, and states do not focus just on their interest in the selfish interest, because then that is short-lived, and obviously that will cause other countries to entrench themselves on positions which are of non-collaboration and non-cooperation.
Thank you, Lawrence. So clearly, complexity is the key. I would say, and I would like to bring this panel to a close, thanking all the panelists, and the message, I guess, the take-home message that we can get from here is that while not necessarily optimistic over the short term that solutions can be found across Europe and between the governments, as we've heard from all the panelists, for sure there are ways to find common ground between the countries if we just try to focus on what's important: dialogue, cooperation, and reframe migration and the narratives and data on that and evidence in a more scientific way and diplomatic way, rather than just politics and fear. So thank you to all for our guests, and thank you for following us for this hour. I encourage you to follow ISPI and our new next initiatives on the Mediterranean for this edition of Rome Med. And thank you. Thank you again to all four of you. And I'm sure we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.